I'll be a little bit different. I'm not a poet, and what I'm going to be talking about tonight and reading some brief messages from comes basically from my childhood when my dad served in World War II in the Navy, and he brought home some souvenirs that he had my mother tucked away in the attic because she had no idea of how her decorator at that time would use these things. So there was part of a Japanese landmine. There was a 30mm shell casing, brass shell casing. Up there, there was a cartoon of him, caricature cartoon of him that was actually done by a sailor who had worked for Walt Disney up there. And then there was a framed thing called a shellback thing in the Navy. That's when you cross the equator. So he served in what we now call Westpac. I happened to also follow in his footsteps, not in the exact way that he did, but I was also in the Navy as a lieutenant, ended up as Lieutenant JG, the same grade that he had when he got out of the Navy in World War II. And in not too long before my mother passed away, she gave Annie a big packet of letters. And these were letters that he had sent to my mother during World War II. And I have been reading those. There's about 74 letters. I'm not going to read you all of those. In fact, I won't even read you all of one of those because we could be here for about a year or so. But I'll read some snippets from some of the letters just to show you some different feelings and things and stuff that way. And my project is to try and figure out what to do and how to present these letters because they do, in initial research, a lot of the stuff that is in the internet and stuff now doesn't have anything like he has, because it was almost a one-year chronicle of his time overseas. And I happened to be, well, he'd only seen me for 1 month after I was born, so he'd be talking about me as the little admiral.
Thank you for your service.
Oh, you're welcome. I never knew. Let's see, I had these pages where they wouldn't stick together. Here we go. I never knew really what he did except for these souvenirs that were in the attic, and he never talked about it. So I've learned a lot of my history and very much his early history because he was only married about a year before he went into the service, and he had been older. He graduated from college, been older, and was probably around 31 or 2 when he volunteered to go in the Navy. And he ended up in a branch that I had to look up. It's called Argus. And I thought, what the devil is Argus? It must be an acronym if it was something for the government, but no. Argus actually comes from a Greek-Roman mythology character that had 1,000 eyes that overlooked one of Zeus's or nymphs, Io. So he was kind of a protector or a guardian to keep this little nymph safe. And so that's originally what his unit was. It was kind of like the Navy SEALs now, only they didn't swim or do anything. They were really a forward radar unit that went out in the jungle, stood in the forest, and directed our planes in to bomb the enemy or to fight the enemy. And so it was a very dangerous position because he would be, in one of the things I'll read, very close to actual enemy, and he was able to pick up these souvenirs from their camp and stuff like that and send them home. The unit was formed. This is from the commander of the unit there in March of 1943, and received limited training on the various radars there from the West Coast, and sailed late in April. And that's about when his letters start, when they were sailing. And so he was going over to what we call Westpac, which is over to the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and that theater of the war at that time. And there was, let's see, 14 or 15 officers and about 40 enlisted men in that particular unit. He went to a school to learn all about the radars and communications, and they did have the best radios back there in this. So they used a lot of the Army and other units and the Navy to get messages with these really high-powered radios. And so when he, I better get my glasses so I can actually read the letters that he sent. They had just crossed over the equator, and they'd been at sea for a couple of weeks. And being on an old ship, the best I can determine, it was called the Dashing Wave, and it was an old kind of merchant ship that they added a couple of pop guns, which are 30 caliber anti-aircraft things. You probably couldn't shoot down a kite with them. But anyway, you know, and they were all hand cranked and this kind of thing. But he was on this old ship, and I was on one World War II ship, the same vintage as what he was on a attack cargo ship. But anyway, he says, well, today everybody's crying. Will this ever end? Not a thing but water, and it's all salt. I guess it's time to gripe after 5 nights of trying to sleep on packing crates, potato piles, or even the steel deck. It gets pretty tiresome. Just picture our dining room filled with 19 men, the storm sash on, a very hot day in July, and then turn the blowers off. Brother, if you have ever heard anybody griping back home about point rationing, please tell them off for me. To top it all off, they plugged up the showers to conserve water. A little bit later, he says, oh boy, this old scow is pitching. We're going through a tropical storm, which has us taking water over the bow, and as we roll, it washes the deck. The best description I can give of her presents action is the twisting, pitching action of a well-trained rodeo steer. This has been going on for about 15 hours now, but I am still hale and hearty, so maybe I really am a sailor. Then it goes on a little later. The old sea is still rough, and when you're on duty on the flying bridge, you feel like you're on a roller coaster. The bow goes so low that it slows the screw, that's the propeller, out of the water, and for a moment it turns in the air, and then bingo, quite a jerk as it comes back into the water again. So that was his kind of trip over a little bit of the stuff. He also goes into great detail of the King Neptune ceremony when you polywogs become a shellback, and that's what that certificate was. And he even talks about how the Navy even recognizes this centuries-old condition of people crossing over the equator and the hazing that they get. And that was quite a thing, but I figured it would be too long to read all of that and miss some of the other things. But he was getting close. The first island that they kind of reached was, or the place in New Caledonia was Noramea. And looking that up, it's actually an old French community there, and it has a very beautiful cathedral high on the hill. but they've been at sea so long, so they needed to just have a little R&R. And so the day that he got off the ship, he says, I just returned from going ashore. I must state it was a rare experience. Typical National Geographic stuff. The natives wear loincloths, their feet are bare and very broad and deformed. In their hair they place ferns, and their ears hold earrings. They are very muscular built, but very dark. Their lady companions usually walk two paces behind them. The best description I can give on their clothing, it's a very colorful piece of cotton with a slit in it for the neckline. It is hemmed around the neck and hangs very, very loose, almost touching the ground. Naturally, they are barefooted. Their hair is kinky and sticks straight up. It's a peculiar red because they put a certain type of root to kill the lice. It's just a comment. I'm not sure about all these young ladies running around that I see with my younger daughters with hair, but I don't think it's necessarily to kill the lice. But moving on, as his time in Naramia there, it says, Saturday night the skipper talked 6 of us into going into town with him at a native place back in the hills. The food was unusual but fair to middling. Afterwards they let me in on the secret that the meat was horse. I guess before this vacation's over I've seen everything as well as eaten everything. So later on, about the 2nd of May, he was talking about one of the first engagements when they were getting ready to move on from Naramia down to Guadalcanal. Says, I was pleasantly sitting on the boat deck writing a letter to Warren, who was his younger brother, 10 years younger than he was. And it was just about chow time, 11:45, when the general alarm sounded. We all went below, and No Lunch Charlie came over from above. He dropped his eggs rather discreetly 50 yards off of our bow, and with the other 3 washing the decks for our companionship. They called him No Lunch, for he seldom takes time out for chow, striking about noon. The rest of the afternoon we had general alarm about every hour and a half. So that was kind of his first area where he actually took fire, bombs from above there. After a while, after being on Guadalcanal, he said a lot of times it got a little boring of what they do. So he said, one of the boys who's been here 6 months started to tell us about the sex life of his pet lizards. So I have to knock off now and get in on the interesting data. He also went on, and I'm not going to read all of that, where he had his pet lizard up there above his mosquito netting that would eat the mosquitoes because they were real plentiful, but it kept the malaria down. But then he talks about a different thing when Eleanor Roosevelt came. He said, Eleanor Roosevelt was on the island one day last week. I don't think she has any place being out here, but you will have to grab the old girl credit, for she has courage of her conviction and actually feels she is filling her husband's role, since it's impossible for him to get around. She was very lucky and got off the island before any trouble. 5 nights previous to her arrival, the Nips had been over 2 nights, and again bombing after the 2 nights after she left, and they started again. They've been pouring it on down here, which is a rather surprise in view of the advanced base. But they figured this is the main supply base, and it wasn't for the censor, which is the guy that cuts out all the mail over here. I wouldn't say they were wrong. So another interesting thing, side about the letters, is the censor actually goes in and cuts out anything that might be giving away the position, giving away anything. So it is kind of fun to go through and have to find research of where he is, and I'm still in that process of kind of a day-by-day thing. But he goes on in the battle of down in Angola, in Gaia, which is on the Dragons Peninsula on New Georgia. And it says, there again we had a memorable experience for the Higgins boat. This is like what we now used to call an M boat, a medium-sized landing craft, which was kind of an English description of their landing crafts there. Starter broke, and we felt like clay pigeons for 2 hours from 1 to 3 o'clock in broad daylight waiting for an airplane to attack, and we thanked the Lord that it never came. Thankfully, we got to Nogai and set up our radio set. From then on, it was just a case of watching out for Charlie. I think I've already described our living conditions in the territory. This was again in a letter to my mother. The strangest thing was to call for airstrikes on Barryhope for a certain time and then rush out to the point and watch the hell. You know how you can stand out in your porch deck and see the folks' house? Well, that's how close we were to the nips. So he also has other things, how close he was and how they had to fight their way out of the jungle to get back to their base camp. So very interesting reading.
Thank you.